What happens when a software engineer moves between leadership and a hands-on role multiple times?
In this episode, we speak with Carlton Lane, who has built teams across Australia, North America, China, and the UK. He's transitioned between individual contributor, manager, and back again by choice.
We dive in to what it really means to switch roles, how international experience shapes leadership, and while understanding engineering and management makes you better at both.
If you're navigating a career transition or wondering if management is right for you, this episode is packed with insights you really won't want to miss.
I'm James Wilson, and I'm a software engineering recruiter based in London.
I'm Matt Sinclair, a 30-year veteran of the software business, and I really can't wait to get into this talk with Carlton. Let's do it, James.
Let's get into it.
Hi, I am Carlton. I've been a software engineering manager for over 20 years. I started my career out in Microsoft. I worked in Seattle for 6 years on Visual Studio. After that, I moved over to Tokyo, Japan, worked on Windows 7 and digital TV for 3 years. And then I moved over to Shanghai, China, where I worked on Azure and Microsoft's commerce platform for 3 years. After that, I went back to being an IC and did a startup for a couple of years. Then I moved over to Amazon, worked on Prime Video for a while, 7 years. Before winning, I moved over to Snapchat, did content creator tools for a while. And then most recently, I've moved to Axon, where we work on real-time public safety software.
That's quite a journey, and I don't think we probably quite capture a lot of what you've done in that intro. You're also a fellow Australian, which we hadn't touched on. You were from Perth, is that right, in WA? Curtin University?
Yeah, that's right. So got my education at Curtin University. I grew up a very typical kind of experience. And it was actually during university that my professor had found that Apple was supporting developers to fly to San Jose to attend the WWDC. And they actually paid for the conference ticket and our airfares. So I went out to the WWDC in 97 and 99. That's when I really networked with the US students and realized I should probably try to get a job in the US. And Apple actually gave me a laptop in 99, which was amazing. I just really wanted to join Apple, but they weren't hiring. Those were the years when they were still struggling. And at the conference, Microsoft was there and they were like, "Why don't you work for us?" And I was like, okay.
Wow.
So it was a little unexpected, but that's how it played out.
So Apple funded your trip, but Microsoft hired you.
That was ridiculous. I was like, I think many years later, I was very grateful for my experience at Microsoft. But at the time, it seemed like I was settling. But it's funny, you have a dream, you have a hope, but it doesn't always play out the way you plan.
No.
This is that's a textbook example of one of my themes that we spoke about last week, James, about you can't control for luck, but you can take advantage of it when it presents itself.
Keeping in mind our theme of helping software engineers, guiding that next step. You mentioned that in your time, I think when you were at Microsoft, you were sort of in a management role, but then you switched to a IC role and then back to a management role at Amazon. I think a lot of engineers could benefit from probably understanding why you might have gone back into an IC role, but then now obviously subsequent have gone down that management track.
So I did 2 manager roles for about 5 years. The first one was in Japan. My manager in Japan had moved to the US and it was easier the team put me in charge, which was a funny, typical maybe way that people end up in management. And we could talk more a bit about that. But the second experience I had was when I moved to China and the team was much larger. The whole organization in China was much larger. So there's a lot more structure in place to develop myself as a manager and really started to appreciate what was leadership about. The thing was, after about 5 years of that, I'd done 7 years of IC and about 5 years of management. And I realized I was missing some of those foundational, the joy of writing code. I think there's certainly joys of leading large, slow organizations, but then getting a lot done yourself or getting a lot done with a bunch of really fun teammates in a startup, it was very attractive to switch gears, go back to something more foundational, just really enjoy building software for a while. It was all C+. It was all like low-level virtualization software. But it just took me right back to why I was in that career industry. It was just a couple of years to really reconnect. And I think it really sharpened my toolbox. And I was really glad that I had done that at that stage of my career.
Okay. And then when you went back into management, you moved from Shanghai to London. So was that
Mm.
something you wanted to do? Did you want to move to London, or was it just the opportunity came up and then you went for it?
Yeah, pretty typically, startup wasn't making a ton of money and having two kids and a wife in China, where it was very expensive. It got a little sketchy in cash flow if they didn't make payroll. And what was also tricky is my wife's American, I'm Australian, so we would have had to have gone to different places. And so we weren't quite sure what we're going to do. So it was the work 50 hours a week at the startup and also train for an interview and land a job being relocated somewhere. It was uh, definitely high pressure times. Completely randomly, Amazon was in Shanghai doing interviews, and I was down to my last buck. So I rode a $5 bicycle down to the nice fancy hotel they were in. Couldn't afford the coffee, but talked to the guys and just a couple others. And they combined them all to create the Prime Video org in London. So that's how I came over as an IC. But I think going back to signals, like when you join an org, like I love that I could ramp up on the code and the technology first. But then when you start to understand how can you make a difference, that was when I realized like organizing the team, getting everybody motivated, coordinating with the US, my toolbox there was going to be more effective than my toolbox of being an IC. And so while I had it and I could have kept doing the IC gig, it just quickly, like, it was easier to go and start to create momentum in London with the team. And that's how I fell back into being a manager. But I think when it starts to move at speed, like Amazon has a very strong manager toolbox. And when you really learn those lessons, it drove me into what it ended up being as a manager of manager within a couple of years. So I think the foundations I learned in China, but I think what really took me to the next level was what I was able to do at Amazon in London.
Can you mentioned something here which I find really interesting. In a very short period of time, you've been obviously coming out of Australia, then in the US, then in China, and then in the UK. So you're kind of bouncing around, and it's quite it's quite an asset to be able to have those exposures to those different cultures. I'm just wondering, what did you find similar and different about those four different cultures, and how did that have any impact on your ability to manage diverse groups of people?
For sure. In China, and this is going back 15 years, so it was like the early 2010s, they were hiring like crazy, but the kind of relationship of working in China and then working the way the US wants to work wasn't quite there. So we ended up with very large teams, and it wasn't efficient. Like if you can imagine, like you've got very high caliber teams and then more junior teams, like the mission of Asia back then was trying to get these sites to at least own and deliver something at the caliber of the US. But it was very high scale, but the output, the efficiency was very low. But the culture was very interesting. Like when I work with folks from Asia in London, like I understand how they work, and I think it's very easy to connect to them after I've spent so much time working with them in Asia directly. And what does it mean to not speak English, or to be a minority, or to feel like you don't quite connect with the culture? It was very hard, some aspects of living in Asia. And so when I manage folks from Asia in Europe, I know exactly what they're going through, and I definitely try to accommodate them, because I know sometimes they're translating things in their minds before they respond, or you need to give them more time in a conversation to digest what you're saying.
Yep.
But it's definitely been wonderful. The European teams are amazing, because I think we can hire so much better talent that the US is just so competitive. And so unless you're working in FANG and there's like direct access to some of the top talent, I think, yeah, US is very competitive to find very good people. Europe, like I could find amazing engineers. And so I'm very proud of the teams that we can put together. All the companies I've worked at, the one consistent thing is that you can hire great people, and then it's amazing what you can do when you've got that foundation locked in.
I must admit that completely aligns with my experience. I spent a year in Singapore in '96, and then obviously worked in Australia. I haven't worked for any length of time in the US, but I've been to the US on work many times. And then the DV years here in London, it was incredible. The quality of it's particularly apparent at the senior engineer level. The quality of the average off the street senior engineer in London is about as good as anywhere I've seen. We probably had, I probably had 200 odd engineers go through the process at DV over the 7.5, 8 years that I was looking after engineering in various forms, not employees, but contractors and so on that we had involved in the work we were doing. And I think we probably made about 5 mistakes in that period, so that the quality is very high. So I completely agree with you that the European software engineering quality is very high.
Just going to make it worldwide known. I think I think there's always a tendency like that teams want to be primarily based in the US. I think it's changed so much though, since looking at what tech looked like. When I first looked at Asia, I was actually looking at Europe as well. And the options were really limited, but these days, like the tech community is so much bigger, which is really good sign.
Sort of looking forward to a theme we might explore in a future episode. There's a lot more to success than just technology. A problem, and I think I mentioned James the other day that when we were talking that if I've ever got a problem that is only a technical problem, I'm completely relaxed, because I know that sort of motivated and well-equipped engineers can solve just about every technical problem you throw at them. It's all the other problems, right? The people problems, the process problems, the politics, capital problems, economic, external factors. That's where things get really tricky.
Yeah, I think that's where leadership has actually been a lot about understanding that big picture. And on the one part, you've got people, you got tech, but it's all these other factors that managers need to get better and better at mastering so that their team has the biggest opportunity that it can have.
Yeah, agree.
Carlton, that's a lot of change that you've been through, from an IC manager back to an IC, back to a manager, different companies, different continents. What experiences did you have along that journey that have shaped your strategy now as a manager?
The lessons you learn as a manager never end. And I think some of the roles really gave me the opportunity to harden the skills. And so now I think there's 4 or 5 things that I really think about when I'm managing teams. First one's probably around the importance of attracting talent. Having good people on the team are like number one job of a manager. I think we talked a little bit about that, so maybe we can skip over it. The second one is probably around the importance of communication, both the spoken communication and written communication. And so personally, I failed English after high school. I actually went to university with English as a second language. But don't ask me what the first. And
if English was your second language, what was your first language?
I think it wasn't.
Let's stop amping these Australian stereotypes.
Although it's very true. When I got to the US, I had a very thick Australian accent. And even the American coworkers that I had a hard time understanding, because I was pretty ucker, as we say, and quickly had to develop spoken business English skills.
Yeah.
That got me going pretty well. I think that's what I used for a long time through Asia, like a very neutral English sounding tone and kind of vocab. In Amazon, they really pushed this to the next level with their written skills. Being able to articulate ideas through written, laying out thoughts or decisions or writing up like root causes. They never used long form like PowerPoints or any of those kind of visual tools. It was always about written, and you had to go into detail so everybody could understand. So that written skill set, like I still use it today, because I find like when you can organize your thoughts and project them concisely and clearly, like it's so much easier to influence people.
Yeah.
If you're just hand waving and trust me, bro, Like it really doesn't scale when you start to work at certain levels of leadership.
Do you know, I read a piece that Bezos wrote on why they got rid of PowerPoint slides inside Amazon. And one of the things that he said, which really stuck with me, was he said, what a PowerPoint deck does is it puts all the cognitive load of understanding the point on the audience. Whereas when you write a document, the cognitive load on explaining a point is on the author to make the text narrative coherent and fit together. And I went, that's a great point. And it comes down to this idea of respect for your audience, right? Which I'm a big fan of. And again, another one of the things about communicating in the language of your audience. If you want to get a point across, you've got to speak the language of your audience. And so it's a fundamental distinction between someone who puts 3 bullet points on a slide and expects the audience to make the conceptual leaps to understand their point versus someone who spends some time, whatever the time might be, to write 3 paragraphs or 2 paragraphs, or even, to be fair, 1 paragraph with a couple of sentences that are coherent, that actually lay out the point you're trying to make in a straightforward way. It's hugely powerful when done properly.
Absolutely. When you mention the audience, like that is certainly true. Rewrite differently depending if it's going out to the team, if it's going to immediate leadership, or if it's going all the way up to the senior leaders of a company. They have different views, and so they need to hear about their thoughts in the level that they're operating in.
Yeah.
And so it was so hard skill to develop. Like I remember, I can write. And then the product guy I was working with just kept sending it back to me and saying, rewrite it. And I just hated it. And I didn't realize what I was learning until later, when today I'm writing papers, our leadership. And I'm like, I'm so glad I went through those lessons, because you can only get into that level of influence if you learn this foundational skill.
Yeah.
And it was really not obvious in early management, but once you realize that's an important skill, it becomes a door opener.
But one thing I learned, which surprised me a little bit, is when you start to get a little bit of access to C-suite, like enterprise, large businesses, C-suite, and even +1 type folks, they do use decks to communicate every now and again, depending on what's going on. But if you put something to a board, it's almost exclusively as a memo, a 2 or 3 page memo on a topic, right? And it's very concise. It's written in operationalized English. And so there may be a deck as background reading that goes in as supporting material for the board papers. But the actual thing that they discuss and make a decision on is almost always a 2 or 3 page memo on the point. And I went, and like, so exactly what you're saying, right? If you want to have influence, if you want to be someone who can influence people in senior leadership positions, you've got to be able to get your points down to 1 or 2 page memo style writing, where someone can look at it. They've got very short period of time in which to make a decision. They've got limited information. They need everything in that one spot so they can understand the context. I understand the evaluation of options that's been done. I see the recommendation. I see the rationale for the recommendation, and I see the next steps.
When I think about my career, there's one big regret I had, which is we were working on this commerce platform for Prime Video, and we actually thought it could come out of Prime Video and just be something more than what Amazon Pay was. Amazon Pay was very wallet-based, and we saw a game would need like subscriptions and need transactions, and everything we built could be reused at a very high level. And I really struggled to explain that to all of our leaders, that what we were building wasn't really just for one domain. But if I had fully understood this skill back then, I think I could have explained this opportunity. And we call them BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals.
Yep.
You can find these, you can present them, you can get them to the right leaders if you can really embrace this skill.
Yeah.
So love it. It's probably why it's at the top of my list.
Yeah. The other one that I'll just to touch on this, I know we probably drilled into a little bit of detail on this one, but the other one that I really love, it really appeals to my sensibilities. I've got a very good mate who was ex-Amazon and talked me through some of these techniques, but the PRFAQ.
Oh, yes.
Which you'll know it better than I do, but do you want to just talk briefly about a PRFAQ?
Yeah, I think the Amazon language is PR, which is the press release, and then the FAQ is all like the frequently asked questions. And so when you kick off a project, if you just define that project exactly what it is, what is the customer promise, what is the thing it's going to do for customers, how are you going to measure it? And then in the FAQs, you can ask specific questions, internal and external FAQs we would do. where you can explain the integrations, all the gory details. If you start to frame a problem and really define exactly what you're going to do and a bit of how you're going to do it, so much of a project can be really understood, and what you are and not going to do covered off in a PR FAQ. Super powerful tool. We actually call them customer promises and frequently asked questions now, because I think we don't always do a press release for every feature, but anything you do has a promise behind it. And so we found that was slightly better language that people would understand.
Okay, yeah.
I love that process as well.
Yeah. The interface as if I were a client to it, and then I'd work out how to go and implement that interface. And I know that's very high level, and I apologies to our dear listener engineer in the audience. I've obviously glossed over a whole bunch of details there, but in principle, the pattern there is that you're putting this thing up as an interface, right? And then you're testing that interface, and then you're going on and doing the work behind it. And so I think it's one thing engineers looking to get into this way of communicating with managers can think in this way, and you can actually draw on some of your intuitions and your experience from being a software engineer to help you make that make sense. That's a stretch, I know, but that's how I always thought about it.
I think that actually brings us to something else that I think would be worth chatting about at Amazon, Microsoft, Snapchat, and now probably even more so at Axon. You've obviously had some pretty intense demands. Is there strategies that you've used in order to keep your team or yourself resilient and focused on what you need to deliver in a tight timelines?
Yeah, for sure. Like, I think, as Matt was saying, sometimes your leadership doesn't have it, and the walls start to fall over pretty horribly. And like, what happens is, your team gets demotivated. Like, you're usually seeing critical people leaving the org. You then start to see a ton of noise start to come in. Like, everybody panics and starts to throw in ideas on what needs to happen. I think it's that critical moment that when I think about leadership, like, this is how you lead. It's like on the really bad days when your manager toolbook is 50% out the window and you have to start to get the team back on track. Like, number one for me was being able to protect the team so that they feel like they're not getting drawn into all of these distractions. And so as we were getting fed all these ideas, I think it's up to the manager and the team to figure out, okay, clearly things aren't going well for us. We might be running out of money in 12 months, or we might be looking at a smaller team because the company's revenue is falling over. I think figuring out then, what are we going to do? The so what of that plan has to be critically come up with by the team to balance. It can't just be all short-term tactical. You can't pack your way out of, we'll just launch a bunch of quick features. At some point, you also have to inject a little bit of strategy that will stack onto these short-term opportunities with some longer-term strategic things that will start to take these short-term things and they start to multiply together. And so we did that in our roadmap. It was a lot of random stuff, and we had to come down to, like, we had essentially two things doing similar but different things that required two teams to maintain them. It was like we had to rapidly get to one. The one had to work for both. We had to land it very quickly so that we could innovate back up to a space where it wasn't just what we had before, but we're actually better than before. And that was kind of another BHAG where it was done what we have. We had to rapidly build a simpler, better feature. And then that was going to be the thing that would get us out of this mess. But through that, like, the team you had to really watch the motivation of your team. Some other project roadmap is one thing. Keeping people happy. There is an opportunity in writing software in a company that really needs people to move fast and get shit done. All the politics goes out the window. You get to really just get shit done. And so I think if you can just keep the team motivated and block out some of that noise, you have the chance to actually build a bit of momentum. I think that there are hard, difficult decisions. There's times there that we've totally ejected our ability to do KTLO because it was just so urgent to get some major pivots done in a short period of time. And so the manager's got to balance the people, the roadmap, the OE, the quality of the live site, and then deliver something that you didn't think was possible with a short amount of resources.
if you've got the pressure coming from above, it must be quite challenging to motivate people when under that type of pressure.
If you really cut to the heart of it, it's your best people that have so much choice that are going to look for the first sign of weakness and then opt out. And I don't blame them. If they got lots of opportunity, they should go and optimize that. I think the responsibility of a leader, of a manager, if you accept that role, is that you're not going to be the first one out the door when shit gets hard. You got to be there to play it out and play it out while everybody else is willing to. But it's for the folks that stay that you need to figure out how to have them understand the dire situation you're in. And that's a people-centric thing. There's not one playbook for all, but I think if you pass it through unfiltered, they will freak out. And so you got to start to tell a story where, hey guys, here's a bit of a sampling. I am shielding you just so you know, like you're not seeing the full picture because we got to do this, but the noise outside of our team. And then,
oh, sorry. I was just going to say on this point, like I don't know whether we're allowed, what our explicit rating is, James, but the shit umbrella, we're allowed one expletive.
We can definitely do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So this idea of it's a tricky thing to get right because on one level, and for two reasons, like internal and external reasons. So one thing is that if you shield all of it from everyone in all its forms, then they actually don't appreciate. You get into a situation, it's a bit patronizing, but also that you get into a situation where they don't really understand what's going on and they don't understand the pressures. But the second thing, which is really important, I think, is that there's only so much negative energy that you can soak up yourself. And you end up if you take it all on, you end up in a situation where you're starting, without realizing it, you're starting to model the behaviors, those negative behaviors you start to model them yourself. And it's really poor for your mental health and for your sort of general well-being. I'm a big fan of the idea of the shit umbrella, right? What I mean by that is that the manager and leader should be able to stand out in front of the team and deflect the crap from them, away from them. But also you have to bring them in a little bit to the conversation so they appreciate what's going on. And it's not easy. Yeah. It's not easy, right? Not easy.
You're really testing, like, hey guys, are you aware times are hard?
Yeah.
And then the next level, hey guys, are you aware that they are like really urgently needing this? And it's going to be different, like the message you can give to your more senior engineers versus your more junior engineers. The junior ones will probably just want to know life is hard, but if I hunker down and do my thing, hopefully we'll be okay. But it's the senior ones that you need to draw them in on, I think. Because I think, as you say, the manager can't possibly do it all. I think 90% of the time, the answer is the manager picks up the slack. Like whatever when you're talking about your OE mechanism or you're talking about anything going wrong, like it's, the manager will have to solve it. And I think that's where the toolbox of a manager is, as a last resort, you have to absorb so many of these things and then work with your team. Delegation is another topic we should talk about where you need that help with your senior folks where they can take the closer to the unfiltered message and then they can game plan it with you. The more you can have a few devs on your team that are like at that level where you can divide and conquer problems between you have a little bit more resiliency. I think if you're by yourself and your team's a bit too junior to step up into that role, you burn out hard. It's a very hard role to be in. And you're going to pick one person that you can develop to get them into that space just to give you that breathing room you need.
When engineers do get put in these situations, they may be very much on board with wanting to jump in and get their hands dirty. But from my experience, the ones that I speak to that are in those situations where they know there's uncertainty, they may have a family, they may have, they have reasons for going, I'm going to look for another job because if this falls out over now, I'm going to need an option.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I think we're all humans. We're all here to work. We're usually working because we have families and there's other accountabilities that we have. And so, you have to keep it all in check. I think I've bottomed out twice in my career. It's not a linear journey where your career and your yearly TC goes up and to the right without it ever going backwards. Like, I have had two massive kind of bottom outs where I've freaked out. It's part of the journey. And so, yes, you need to protect yourself. I think it's not always companies are the same. And so like when they go through these rough patches, if you do stick them out, these are usually where the career opportunities come from.
Yeah.
The more you've got the trust of the senior leadership when they need to stand up and do new things, you're the first name that comes up. And so I think you will learn more in a team under duress than a team that's just chipping away, everything just groovy.
I completely agree with this, right? And the not that people should necessarily go looking for trauma, but trauma bonding is a pretty powerful teacher. And the other thing I'll say actually is that failure is a much better teacher than success.
For sure. Like, I think it's human. Like, you pull it off, you're like, no, of course I was going to nail it. And maybe you don't really reflect on all the lessons.
Yeah.
But I think failure really gets you to reflect on the lessons.
Yeah.
And it comes up when I interview people and you hear them talk about their projects. And I find that sometimes people will just walk you through a project and they don't really understand the lessons of what happened. I was like, yeah, A happened, then B happened. I was there, and it's like, okay, great, you were there, but I'm not quite sure if you really understand the key decisions and the lessons and what you do differently. And I think that's where I really try to make sure, hopefully it's not just the traumatic failures, but in all situations, are you really learning what you can learn from the projects you're on?
Yeah.
Pushing yourselves to those hard decisions, finding the people-based lessons, the process-based lessons, the data-based lessons. There's so many things you can look at to see what was unique. And from that, you can learn something so that next time you'll do it better.
And I'm going to just tie two threads together here from this conversation. Right? So that we're talking about writing, professional writing, and I'm constantly lamenting how bad professional writing, the quality of professional writing is. And I think actually that's why PowerPoint slides are so common, because it's easier than it is to write. But one of the things that I recommend people do, and I'll tie this in with this lessons learned thing, I recommend people write stuff down and be intentional about what they're doing. And write it down either as a blog, as a journal, I don't mind, but actually write it down and write it in coherent sentences because what that gets you, you learn to be a better writer, first of all. But what is to people, if you've ever done anything with script writing or writing plays and so on, they sort of talk you through this. If your story, if your script is this happened, then this happened, then this happened, right? It's boring as hell. No one likes that. You have to have stories where there's change, there's an emotional transformation. Someone goes from here to there, and in that process, they have some kind of emotional lesson, and that changes them in some way. And so the best source of that is failure, right? I think in what we do, right? The best sort of well to draw on to pull those stories out is failure stories. And then if you combine that with the writing, you've actually got some rich material, and you can quite quickly set yourself apart as an engineer by the person who's captured these stories and expressed them in a way that resonates with people, and it's enjoyable, right? Someone reads a story and they like it. It's that gives you a bit of creative nourishment, but it's also very instructive to be able to capture those lessons and write about them.
Especially like reality of tech industry hiring is that you tell these stories.
Yeah.
And the way we do like yearly performance discussion is you're supposed to recap your stories. And so I love your suggestion. I'm like, that's what I personally do. I've never thought about it, but I just have a folder where I just write down when things interesting have happened and I keep notes on them. It makes it so much easier for when you're doing something that requires you to go back and remember. Yeah. Capturing in the moment, what was the really ambiguous thing? What was the really person that needed to be influenced? How did you really pull together different options and come up with a recommendation?
And so I've been doing this, exactly what you talk about, in writing and publishing. I've been doing it for probably not all my career, but probably 15 years. I'm a kind of psychopath with Emacs and text notes and everything, and I keep notes on everything. People think I'm crazy. But one really interesting, unintended, positive consequence of me keeping all these text notes over the years is I have this massive text database of everything I've done, right? And what tech has popped up recently that is pretty good at managing text, right? And so I'm actually in the process of trying to put my collective wisdom, aggregate wisdom, as it were, over the years into something that I can kind of query in an intelligent way, not to publish to anyone, but as a tool for myself, so I can sort of have a conversation with myself at the time, or in the moment as it was. It's a little sort of side project I'm working on at the moment, but it's I would encourage. I would encourage anyone starting out to start to put their thoughts down, because we have some pretty impressive tools that are emerging now, which can really help you be a multiplier with that. What was the thing I learned on Project X? I remember we did a project on, I don't know, last mile mobility. Oh yeah, that was Project blah. Oh, what was it? What went wrong on that? Oh, okay. Here's the 3 things that went wrong. All right. What did we do? Oh, that's right. Here's the 3. And it's this gold mine of information that's better than
Yeah.
stuff. I'm saying, so like, to tie those 2 things together, failure is a better teacher than success. Writing is a really underutilized skill, and you need to be a good writer and communicator to make that transition from individual contributor up to management. And it's even more true in leadership, right? What happens when you get to leadership is not only do you have to be able to write about things, you've got to be able to perform them, right? You've got to be able to perform them narratively. You've got to stand up in front of people and tell those stories in engaging ways, right? So that's the next power up that comes after being able to write. You've got to be able to speak.
Yes.
Obviously, you guys deal with a lot of the hiring of engineers, but from just looking at a CV or prepping someone for an interview, the ones that perform well are the ones that know all about those projects that they worked on, and going back to before, why they worked on a project, but actually, particularly if they're an individual contributor, in detail talking about the problem. That's hard to remember when you go, oh, I'm going to look for a new job, and go back 2 years of history trying to remember all those things. So I think that's valuable for anyone in a role to just jot down those problems and things that they're doing.
It's also a cool little side project, right? As an engineer, you want to scratch an itch of something. If you've got this corpus of text and notes and stuff that you've done on projects, it's a nice little personal RAG that you can set up and run yourself.
Yeah.
So eventually, instead of doing interviews, we just train our own Carlton GPT, and you can just interview against my GPT.
So there's a bunch of unintended consequences. Not all of them are positive that come out of this, but we can maybe do a whole episode on how this can go wrong.
Some of what we said there makes me think a little wider in your role now, Carlton, because when some of these things, when you're at, say, Snapchat or Amazon, the consequence of something going wrong could be maybe some people lose their jobs, maybe, they get consolidated into another area. It doesn't look good, whatever. But obviously in your new role, and you can perhaps summarize a little bit to the listeners what Axon actually does. But from what I understand, some of the technology you're working with has the potential to save lives. So some of your decisions are seriously critical in how you go about doing things.
Yeah. What I've discovered in my latest role is it's that thing of going back to the tech foundations. I think after managing managers for many years, I think I've done another hook back towards getting into and not just managing large orgs. Axon is all about public safety. And the mission of the company is to actually write code that will save people's lives. It's a global company, but like in the US, you can see that there is many police interactions where people interact with the police and someone dies. And whether that's the police officer with guns or whether that's a high-speed chase hitting an innocent person. Unfortunately, society is currently in a spot where that happens far too often. And so I decided to jump into the company that is focusing on this problem, which is phenomenal. Like it's the thing that many people might notice is the body cams. This is the company that has a little yellow triangle in the top right corner of the police body cams. So the first thing they had built was a body cam so that we could get high resolution, high quality videos of police interactions to really understand what's happening. The other tech that you may have heard of is the Taser, which is a use of force tool in the UK. So it's the equivalent of using pepper spray or back. But the idea is to give the police something besides a gun so that everybody can go home. Like if the only tool the police officer has is a radio and a gun, more often than not, somebody won't go home. But with a Taser, in the UK, we have batons, we have pepper spray. With cameras, we can actually coordinate responses and more people go home. So my role is on real-time operations, which is, if you can imagine, police have a control center where they can see where all the cars are and where all the individual officers are. And so where each one of these body cameras and the cars have SIM cards in them, And that data is being relayed to a map so that you can see exactly where everybody is at any moment. And if they're under duress, tentpole use case is they have a button on the camera that says, watch me. This is when the police officer is really in trouble and they need immediate help. And so when they click that, my team in real-time operations takes the signal from the device and gets it onto the website within a second. So if a police officer needs help and they're pressing this is no longer consumer software where if it works most of the time, that's okay. This must work. Ideally 99.99, but we're looking for 99.999 reliability. So mission critical software I think it sparked the technical in me of like, how do you build something that reliable? Like even during deployment, even during our last big outages, because somebody cut the line to an Azure data center, like even natural disasters, even through all of these things that you don't directly control, they press that emergency button. Our software will continue to work exactly as it was intended. So I love working in this space, but it's really changed the way I've always designed system architecture. I've found that you wouldn't do the number of microservices that Amazon did. Like we're looking for simpler architectures. We're looking for more redundancy. We're looking for more caching. We are careful about the dependencies that you buy, like the cloud services you use versus just building things yourself. And to get the reliability, we actually use multi-cloud. And so you end up with these kind of quite complex architectures, quite different to what I've done in the past. But the use cases are amazing. It's really enjoyed mission critical over.
I could see how engineers seeing the clear benefit of doing what they're doing would be easier to get on board with doing things the right way or going that little bit extra to figure out a way to do it properly.
Yeah, for sure. I think it is, I think aspirationally, everybody understands like that's our mission. Like our customer promise is that it must work like a utility. Like radios always work relatively, but like radio technology has been deployed through cities and they speak into it. It's very unusual that a radio doesn't work. They've gotten rid of all the dead spots. But I think system architecture and the way of building code, if you put in tons of caches and tons of redundancy, you blow out your latency. And so you have different problems. And so it's not an easy thing to solve. Like I've found that we have to spend way longer in design being scientists, like actually proving we would build out like one pattern and then scale it to 100x what we expected to do and just watch it run to see the size, the latency. Something's coming. It's either the cost or the latency, but cap theorem is very much at play. And so you can't just fire money at it. You can't just make it redundant. There has to be some smarts the team has to apply. And so being able to build in an environment where we have the time to design, but coming up with these answers, very interesting because you can't just follow the classic YouTube tutorials and then build out yet another kind of classic pattern. It requires a little bit more time with the team to explore. They feel like the design process is a bit repetitive. And so them are used to like, I just want to get into write code. And we had to explain, we're close, but we're not quite there. And the obsession to get to the top means you have to take another loop on the design. That could be frustrating, but that's why we're chasing 4 nines.
Very few people working in software actually work in the sort of with the sort of problem you're talking about, or the sort of problem that we were talking about in those switching dates. And they end up just making these over-architected, over-engineered messes, right? And so it's actually interesting when you do have those problems. I used to say this to the engineers back then. It's basically remember the 3-finger thing with electricity and physics at high school, right? So I had this sort of 3-finger problem when I was thinking about this kind of software. One dimension is functionality, okay, and we kind of all know what that is, and that's as far as most modern web apps are concerned, that's really the only problem you've got to solve is to develop the functionality. But okay, so they have that problem, but equally in reverse, I get so frustrated with engineers who are trying to solve problems that only Google or Facebook had when they're trying to just build a basic, tens of thousands of user SaaS business service. Right. And then just one final comment. We mentioned LLMs before. What you're talking about here and this kind of problem is exactly the reason that software engineers are not going to be displaced by LLMs in our current sort of working lives, because there are no generic off-the-shelf web tutorials that'll give you the architecture to design the system that you're talking about, or the system that payment switch in my case. They just don't exist because they're built bespoke under extremely complex and complicated sets of requirements and so on. So anyway, it's super interesting.
For sure. Exactly, where the developers will get to use these AI tools to help them be more efficient, but everything we're doing is so unique to different domains that you need that high judgment. And I guess where I've been trying to push is like the team needs to enjoy learning through failure in a design is just as much progress as writing code. If you can have deeper and deeper understanding of a system, even if you haven't written it, you have the understanding of all the failure modes it could run in, how it could recover if this or if that. And I think that's where teaching developers to value that knowledge, and to then, again, going back to don't just, that didn't work, this finally works. Yay. The experience and being able to say, that didn't work because of this. And therefore that didn't work because of this. And therefore we tried that. Yep. If you can truly join those dots together, that experience, next time you're looking at a similar problem, you would get, okay, I don't need to do the first two things. I'm going to jump to the third thing, see if that will work. Yeah. And I think that's where, just to bring it all together, that's where engineers have to really take those lessons from the history, apply it to first-class design. Then you can build amazing things really quickly.
I'm going to take this opportunity to plug Gall's Law, which is what I've got it actually printed out and stuck up on the wall next to me, Gall's Law. I will drop a note in the show notes, but essentially the idea that no complicated system ever started out complicated, right? It was a set of iterations over a small, simple system that worked. And any time you start out with a complex system, you start out with complexity, it's just doomed to failure. But anyway, check out Gall's Law. As an engineer, it's one of my favorite axioms of being a software engineer. Can I ask one last question, Carlton, before we wrap up? I'm gonna ask every guest this same question, because we spoke about it when we did our pilot. It's this kind of the motivation for me for doing this podcast series. But so imagine you could make a call to your 25-year-old self today. What would you say to them in relation to all of this management leadership stuff?
I definitely learned everything myself, and through that, I was the hard way. And so I think if you've got people listening and trying to learn, I think that's so much better than the way I did it. And so I think investing yourself and understanding all these different things that have helped other people grow. I think it was much harder before YouTube was really common. I think it was much harder when it was just a bunch of dry books. Like the same book was for everyone. You couldn't find the book or the style that was specific for you. But I would say definitely I've identified these things. Go and learn what makes sense for you, and then go and really try to excel in learning those areas. Don't just think the only thing I need to do is show up and work on the company's code. Like, it's about investing in you, and a better you is going to have you participate better at the company. The company is going to give you 90% of your career growth, but hopefully that last 10%, which is what you really want, you go and get yourself, because you're actually actively thinking about this. And I always value keeping your tech skills super strong. I think finally, time is precious. So really think, we talked about writing down what you're learning and getting out of roles, and then think about your career development plan and be cognizant of what you're learning in a role. Look for the opportunity in that role. I think you can jump around too quickly. So you want to spend enough time in a company to get to the heart of their problems, solve some big problems. But again, don't conversely stay there forever and ever unless you're changing subtly your role and you're learning new things and you're doing different things. So if your time is valuable, which it is, keep track of the things you're learning and make sure that's sending at least your tool to be better and sharper and stronger. And I wouldn't just sit there and hope one day the company will reward me with a promotion. I just build my tools.
That's a wrap. A huge thanks to Carlton for joining us today and sharing his insights with us.
If you like this episode, please hit follow and share it with someone that you think might benefit from these insights. Thanks, James. Looking forward to the next episode. See you there.
Thanks, Matt.